Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
If you have not yet, find either if you printed it out or find on your screen the text sheet that was sent around in the Shabbat bulletin yesterday, a different text sheet that was sent around for the other service. This is the one that I prepared. And because we're going to be looking at 5 or 6 or 7 different texts, then it'll be easier if you have it somewhat in front of you. But let me build up to this. As I shared at the opening event for Hanukkah on Thursday night, one of the events that Rabbi Schatz and her team have put together for this community so that really every night of this holiday we can be together even from a distance. I shared that in my rabbinic weeks, in terms of my engagement with the weekly material, they vary, and sometimes they vary randomly. I don't know if you think about this, and there's no reason why you would, because we all live our own lives. You don't live others' lives. In a normal week, I address and share and teach and comment on the Parsha sometimes between 7 and 15 times in a week, right? Because I'm the kind of rabbi who likes being informed by what's happening in the weekly Parsha, whether I'm speaking at a bris or a baby naming or a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a board meeting or a Friday night talk or a meditation or a you-know-what, something from that week is speaking to me. Sometimes I jump around. I jump around from different places in the Parsha. I certainly jump around through different commentaries. And by the time the week is done, if one had listened to me and if I'm listening to myself, a dozen different mini topics have been brought to light. And sometimes something grabs me early in the week and it stays with me and it continues to cook like a slow cooking cholent, which we obviously miss from our time at shul. And this is one of those latter weeks. And I can in some ways thank Larry Herman, who I know is on this Zoom call, and I think Rick Muller might be as well, for this week, and it really is a thanks. They invited me to participate in their Haftarah Plethora, their weekly video podcast on the Haftarah. And because of that invitation, am I investigating this Haftarah in depth in a way that I hadn't in quite some time, right? I'm in relationship with this text, but I'd not gone into it in depth for quite some time. Some of the imagery and particularly some of the questions about why we read it on Hanukkah stayed with me. So some of that I shared in the Haftarah Plethora podcast. If you've seen it, if you haven't seen it, you still can. And then there was an expansion upon that idea. It actually ended up informing the meditation that I shared with the community on Wednesday. As some of you know, I share a meditation every Wednesday and Friday at noon, both on Zoom and on Facebook. And I want us to look at it. I want us to look at these. It's one full chapter of the book of Zechariah, the 3rd chapter, plus a little bit of the chapter 2 and a little bit of chapter 4. And the question I had you think about before Sandra read the Haftarah was why you think the committee, let's call it that, the committee of sages, of rabbis, who were choosing which prophetic section to read as a dessert to the Torah reading on Shabbat of Hanukkah, why they would have chosen this one, a higher threshold to have chosen this one than a normal Haftarah, because as we said, this Haftarah is also in its entirety the Haftarah for another Parsha. And there are many possible answers, and I'd like to hear some of them before we start. So I believe at this point everyone can unmute themselves, and if you would like to unmute yourself to share, please do so. We might have a situation where 2 people are going at the same time, but that's okay. You'll figure it out. If whether you read the commentary or that gives the Eitz Chaim's explanation as to why this Haftarah was chosen, or you're coming at it from your own, give me a reason. Give me an explanation for why this would have been a great choice. And again, I can't see everyone out there, so I'm just going to have to wait for someone to pipe up.
Not by power, not by might, not by power.
Okay, so Brent, you're going right there, which is great, and we're going to then build back up to it. But give me 2 sentences why. Why is Zechariah's call for not by might, not by power, which depending on which Jewish summer camp you grew up going to, you may have learned it as a song, not by might and not by power, but by spirit alone shall we all live in peace. Why is that a Hanukkah message?
Because that we will get to where we need to be by our faith in God, not by a military might. The Hanukkah story, which arguably is a military victory, is treated as the power of God and not the military victory is downplayed. So this is another example, I think, how the prophets explain that they, in their own way, don't like military ventures and don't want to use military power to acquire the possession of Jerusalem, and they have to do it by faith. So it's another stamp of the rabbinical preference for prayer and deeds of kindness and not using military power.
Great. So let's linger on that for a second, and I want to hear other answers, and then we're going to look at the text, right? We're dealing with, let's think of three different populations in our mind. There's the population of the generation that actually built the second temple, to which the prophet of the Haftarah, Zechariah, is speaking to, right? That's the people who lived through the era of actually making it happen. There's the population of the Chashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, who were, depending on how you think of the story, religious zealots who probably would not have thought that much of we secularized American Jews. And also, they were attached to a military campaign because somehow in concert, right, the military defeat of the Assyrian Greeks and the spiritual rededication of Jewish life is what we would call it an erbuvia in Aramaic. It's a mixing, an intermingling that can't really be pulled out. Somehow combine those two things, create the story of Hanukkah. And then a couple of hundred years later, give or take, the rabbis who are descendants of some of the people who are of the Hanukkah era are actually now making decisions about what we should read to commemorate it. And so what you're offering is that the rabbinic class is looking backwards upon the events from the 165, 163, 162 BCE and saying, whatever you think you know, whatever Josephus tells you, whatever your historians tell you about that era, about Judah the Maccabee, and about spears, and about killing the elephants of the Assyrian Greek warriors, remember that a couple of hundred years before that, Zechariah says, this spot is sanctified not because of military might. This spot is sanctified because of the spiritual might that is going to be lived out at this temple. That's one possibility.
Yeah, you're so much more eloquent than I am. So yeah,
I don't know about that, that's the argument I think you were making, right?
Yes.
And that is a powerful argument, and we're going to build back to that argument. But let me hear any others. Are there other explanations as to why, Jennifer, why this Haftarah for this holiday?
Can I ask a question to help me decide whether I have? So why is Joshua the defendant? Is it because he was a military leader? And so is that why he's being challenged?
It's an interesting realpolitik, right? That is probably deserving of its own class. Okay. But you've got in this generation of Jewish control over the land of Israel, you've got the spiritual presence of the high priests, which Joshua is one of, and then you have the civic administration, which Zerubbabel represents.
Right.
They're supposed to be mingling together. They flank the menorah, and Zerubbabel himself is considered to be a descendant of King David, so he's got yichus because he's a descendant from King David. Joshua has yichus because he's a descendant of Aaron and the Levites, and it's hard to know if in that scene where he's being kind of dressed down and to be redressed in more glorious garments, if it's he himself, is something about Joshua, this particular high priest, or something about that caste, right? The population of high priests. There's something about that that community that had allowed itself to become filthy and therefore needs to be redressed in beautiful garments, right? There are differences of opinions about that, but it may be Joshua qua representing a priestly class that we know. If you read the books of the prophets and as a piece of history, you know that both the kings and the priests were susceptible to all sorts of negative influences that take away some of the sheen of leadership around the temple.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So do you want to offer a thought then?
No, now I'm going to listen more.
Okay. Anyone else? Why this haftarah? Is there a sentence, an image, a phrase, a thrust of this haftarah that makes it Hanukkah-ish? Going once? Yes, Larry Diane. There you go.
Okay. So, this seems to be talking about a rededication of the temple after the return from Babel. So it basically parallels historically the rededication of the temple in the Hanukkah story.
Great. So another answer is it's a little more of a pshat answer, which is that there's a historical binding together of the commemoration that we're remembering in the holiday and of the moment that the Haftarah explains. And we'll remember that when we get to the third or fourth source as to the comparison between the choice of this Haftarah for Hanukkah compared to the Haftarah which is said if there are two Shabbatot of Hanukkah, which happens if obviously the first day of Hanukkah is Shabbat. Good. So there could be just the notion of Hanukkah rededicating the temple. This is a rededication of Jewish presence on that spot. It's the set course of events that allowed the temple to be built on that spot anyway. Okay, let's look at the text a little bit.
Eli wanted to say something.
Oh, I didn't see. Who else?
Eli Lito.
Eli, vakasha.
Yeah, there's a description of a menorah, the detailed description of a menorah. And I think that's very, very important.
Very good, right? So in the fourth chapter of Zechariah, a couple of verses before Brandt's not by might and not by power, we've got a description of the primary symbol of this holiday, right? Verse 2, Vayomer Eli, he said to me, Ma'ata ro'eh, what do you see? Va'omar, I responded, Ra'iti, I have seen, V'hinei menorat zahav kula, I see a beautiful gold menorah, V'gula al rosha, and there's a kind of a bowl above it, V'shiva nerot tehaleha, and 7 candles upon it. It's, by the way, a menorah, not a Chanukiah, right? It's the menorah of the number and the style from the temple. Shiva v'shiva mutzakot lenerot asher al rosha. So maybe it's just the image of the menorah that is the connective thread. Okay, let's look at the text, and I'll read them all out loud in case there's anybody follow along who doesn't have it in front of them. The first one actually just comes from the Haftarah itself, the 4th chapter of Zechariah, verse 6. It's the one that Brand pointed us to. Vaya'an vayomer Eli lemor. He answered, and he said back to me, Zed devar Adonai el Zerubbabel. So this is Zechariah saying, this is what God wants to say to Zerubbabel. Who is Zerubbabel? The kind of civic leader of the generation. Lo v'chayil v'lo v'choach. It's interesting that this message is given to Zerubbabel and not to Joshua. You who are in charge of logistics and fundraising and gathering the might of the people that would need to actually build a structure. I'm telling you, it's not with chayil. Chayil is an interesting Hebrew word. In modern Hebrew, it means a fighting force, right? Chayil avir is the air force. A chayal is a soldier. In biblical Hebrew, it doesn't only have a military connotation, right? An eshet chayil, I don't think we're supposed to be understanding it as a female soldier in that book, in that verse from Proverbs, but a woman of valor. That's how it's often translated. I'm not sure valor is the best translation of chayil, but here it seems to be in parallel to koach. Koach is force, strength, muscle. It's not going to be with the military achievements, and it's not going to be with force. It doesn't say what isn't, right? There's an implied. Not by might and not by power. What? Whatever. The building of this temple, the construction of your society, the construction of your life itself is not going to be with muscle, ki'im beruchi, but rather with my spirit, Amar Adonai Tzvaot, said the God of hosts. It's an interesting, by the way, moniker for God in this verse. That's worth pausing on as well, because Adonai Tzvaot, right, there are a lot of ways that God's described in the Tanakh. Adonai Tzvaot is a rather militaristic image of God, right? The God of the hosts. What does that mean, the host? The God who has the heavenly hosts of heavenly fighters along with God. So in the moment where God says that you are not going to achieve your ends with might and power, God is referring to God's self as the God of celestial power. So maybe that is ironic, or maybe it is reinforcing the fact that there is enough power in the heavenly host through spiritual connections. You do not need to rely on your spears and on your shields. Okay. That's the verse itself. Look at the next text, which is from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Megillah. It's in the end of Megillah that a lot of the liturgical choices that we take for granted because we've inherited a fixed liturgical setting are enumerated. So where you find which haftarot are done for which holidays, it's all in this section of Masechet Megillah, which at its core is focusing on Megillat Esther, but has a lot of shul-based davening rules are enumerated there. Okay, so this is what the Talmud says. Bachano, and the Talmud, if you're not used to it, is very terse. So you have to really fill in. And you see on the left side of the translation, the words in bold are just the translations from the words of the Hebrew, and everything else is an interpolation to make it clear what the words are saying. B'Chanukah b'Nesi'im. On Hanukkah, the Torah reading that you do are the princes. That's the Maftir Aliyah that Aaron read before, the gift that the princes gave to the dedication, not of the second temple, obviously, not even of the first temple, but of the Mishkan in the desert. Umaftirin, and what do we do for a haftarah? And a reminder that the word haftarah is the noun of the verb lahaftir, maftirin, which means to take leave. It's really the ending of the service. We read from the book of Zechariah, starting with chapter 2, B'nerot de Zechariah. It's interesting how the Talmud mentions it. The Talmud says the choice here has to do with the nerot. So it actually accords mostly with what Eli said, right? Very terse language. It basically nicknames this haftorah nerot Zechariah. Zechariah's candles. If the nickname of the haftarah is Zechariah's candles, then the connection must be the menorah itself. The mikle shtei Shabbatot, if it happens that there are two Shabbatot, because Shabbat is Hanukkah is 8 days, so if the first day is Shabbat, then the 8th day will be Shabbat. Kamaita b'nerot de Zechariah. On the first Shabbat, Kamaita means the first one, you read the haftarah of Zechariah. Batraita, on the second one, you read from the Book of Kings, number 1, chapter 7, starting with verse 40, B'nerot Shlomo, other candles. What candles? Not candles of a haftarah related to the second temple, that's ours, but candles that appear in the haftarah related to the first temple, King Solomon's temple, built in the 970s, 960s BCE. Okay, and if this had been a year where we had two Shabbatot, on the second Shabbat of Hanukkah, we read that one. Turn to the next source. Rashi. I want to tell you something about Rashi before we read this text. Rashi comments on pretty much every line of the Torah and of the entire Bible. And Rashi comments on pretty much every line of the Talmud. And of course, sometimes the Talmud quotes verses from the Bible. And sometimes it's interesting to compare what Rashi says on the verse as it appears in the Talmud compared to what Rashi says on the verse itself, right? So here we're going to have Rashi on this section of the Talmud that is quoting from the book of Zechariah, and then we're going to see Rashi on the verse of Zechariah itself. So Rashi on the line from the Talmud, on the phrase Nerot de Zechariah, that nickname for our haftarah, the candles of Zechariah, Rashi gives us the opening words that Sandra read so beautifully, Roni v'simchi, translate here, a shout for joy. It's really, Roni means be joyful, simchi means be happy. Al Shem, Ra'iti v'hinei menorat zahav kula. So Eli Baruch Shekivanta. Rashi on the Talmud agrees with you. Why do we read the holiday that the Talmud nicknames Nerot de Zechariah? Rashi says, it's from the section beginning, rise and be very joyful, Israelites, because of the verse from early on in chapter 2 that we just read before. Behold, I see a gold menorah. That's a good reading of the Talmud, right? That's one of the three readings that we had out there was connected to the menorah. Okay. Now look at the next source, Beit Yosef. What's the Beit Yosef? You need to learn a little bit of halachic history here. You may have heard the phrase the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. It was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 16th century in Tzfat. It was based on 4 sections, 4 columns. And that division of 4 columns was based on a book written about 150, 180 years before that called the Tur, or Arba Turim, the 4 columns. And the Arba Turim was the first halachic work in the Middle Ages after Maimonides' Mishnah Torah to gain a lot of influence. And many commentators wrote commentaries on it. The Beit Yosef is the commentary on the Tur written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who soon after is going to write his own code of Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch. So this is not from the Shulchan Aruch, but this is from the author of the Shulchan Aruch's commentary on the Tur. And this is on the fourth of the column called Orach Chaim, the way of life, which has in it the laws of davening, the laws of Shabbat, and things like that. And here's where we get to. The Korin beParshat Naso b'Nesiim. So we read from Parshat Naso in the Torah reading on Hanukkah from the princes. Mishneh bePerek B'nei Ha'ir. This is said explicitly in the chapter of Talmud called B'nei Ha'ir, which is the chapter of Talmud that we quoted from before, from the 31st page of Megillah. B'Chanukah b'Nesiim, we read this already. Hanukkah, we read from the princes. U'Maftir b'nei Rot Zechariah, and we do a haftarah from the candles of Zechariah. Roni b'Simchi, the joyful Israel. V'im chalbo shtei Shabbatot, if there were 2 Shabbatot of Hanukkah, maftirin b'shnayim, on the second one, we read b'Melachim, from the Book of Kings, b'nei Rot shel Shlomo, from the candles of Solomon. Pashut, b'Perek B'nei Ha'ir. That's also explicit and simple in the Talmud. V'chatav Haran, he quotes a sage called the Ran Rabbeinu Nisim of Girondi, a Spanish commentator. Af agav d'neirot de Shlomo kadimi. He says, wouldn't you have reversed it? Wouldn't the first, if you have 2 haftarot, each referring to the construction of one of the temples, wouldn't you think that the primary haftarah, the one that you read every year, should be the first temple, right? The first one built by Solomon. Whereas if there happened to be 2 Shabbatot, then you read a little bit of Zechariah. He says, no. The Ran says that even though that the candles of Solomon, Kadimi, are first, they're the first temple, Afilu Hachi, despite that, Adifilan, it's more preferred for us, the Zechariah. We read the Zechariah Haftarah every year on Hanukkah. Why? Mishum de Nevuot Atid Ninu. I'm going to translate it and tell you that this is an answer that says Darsheni, that says there's something missing here. The Ran's explanation is because the Haftarah of Zechariah has to do with Nevuot Atid, prophecies of things that are going to happen in the future, they are preferable. So his argument is this. Yeah, we would have chosen to read Solomon's Haftarah on every year in Hanukkah, but since that's describing something that already took place, whereas Zechariah's Haftarah is describing something that's about to take place in the future, the prophecy about how the temple is going to be built, that's why it's preferable. I don't buy it. And I don't buy it, meaning I think there's something else brewing here. There's something else brewing from the Talmudic era and still in the Middle Ages. This is the Beit Yosef writing in the year 1550, 1560, that's still trying to find out what is it about Zechariah's words that gave it the significance that it has as being the Haftarah every year on Hanukkah. And the fact that he quotes the Ran, and the Ran's answer is not so compelling, at least to me, suggests that there is something else in this story that needs to be uncovered. Okay. Thoughts or questions so far? Now we look at Rashi, again, but not Rashi on the Talmud quoting Zechariah, but Rashi on Zechariah itself. Okay, Rashi's linear commentary on the prophet Zechariah on our verse, or set of verses, dealing with the not by might, not by power, the part that that Brant quoted before. So the quote from the verse is Zed Devar Adonai El Zerubbabel. This is the word of God from to Zerubbabel, again, that civic manager of this prophet. Ze siman lecha lahavtiach et Zerubbabel. The way Rashi on the verse explains it is, this image of not by might and not by power is some kind of a symbol of the promise that God is trying to give to Zerubbabel. Kishem shahazetim v'hashemen hazeh nigmar me'elav. Just as you notice that the olives and the olive oil that are present in Zechariah's image and are present before you, Zerubbabel, nigmar me'elav, miraculously become what they're supposed to be of their own accord, right? So Rashi is saying what's being told to Zerubbabel is you're looking at a cruise of olive oil, and somehow this olive oil became olive oil without the standard procedure. No one had to step on it. No one had to press it. No one had to use their muscles. Somehow these olives became olive oil of their own. L'chol dvarav, kach lo v'chayel lo b'choach. Similarly, Zerubbabel, you are overseeing this process. I want you to use this olive oil as a metaphor. It's not going to be through might. It's not going to be through power. Shebachem tasu et binyan beiti. You're not going to build my house the normal way you would think you would have done it. And again, remember the introduction, this haftarah is coming after a strange and frustrating, probably infuriating delay. Ezra has brought the Israelites back to the land of Israel. They are permitted to build it, and it's not going up. It's getting delayed and delayed and delayed. So Zechariah teases out an image of miraculous olive oil coming from miraculously self-squeezing olives, and God's message is, that's the way they're going to build the temple. Now, if you get that kind of a message, what do you do with what do you do with it? And if I had gotten the message 5 years ago, Rabbi, you're not going to build the new sanctuary with wood or steel or fundraising. God will do it, right? God will do it. It's like the classic joke, right? I sent you the helicopter, I sent you the boat, I sent you the car, but you didn't participate yourself in saving yourself from the flood. Look what Rashi says in Ki'im Beruchi, but rather it's going to be through my spirit. Ani eten ruchi al Dariush, that's Darius. I will put my spirit upon the current Persian king, Darius, v'aniach lachem, and he will permit you. There is another version of Rashi, that Samech Alach means Sirin Acherin. There's another way of another text of Rashi that says, v'yetzavelach, and he will command you, leave note to build, v'lasot kol tzarchei yitziat habinyan mishalo. He's going to make the entire building of the temple come out of his own coffers, not your own. V'lazor is going to help you, v'chitin with wheat, v'yain and wine, v'shemen v'etzim, with oil and with wood. Kemoshe mufarash the Ezra v'lo titztarchu le'ezrat adam. So on the verse, Rashi says that what's significant here is not the candles themselves, but that this process is going to come to be through its own spiritual power. It's very hard to actually manage a process if you believe in it. It's also, I think, very hard or very dangerous to put too much faith in your own ability to gather resources and turn them with your power, influence, authority into what you're dreaming about. Usually there is some kind of a relationship between the actual mechanism of the process coming to be and some other spiritual coming together that had to have been present as well for the success to be what the success is. That's what Rashi said on the verse. Zerubbabel, you may be a civil engineer, but the civil engineering is not what's going to make this temple stand. I'm going to skip the Isaiah quote for now, just because I'm not sure we're going to have enough time for it. If you want to read it on your own, Isaiah in chapter 11, is not our Haftorah here, gives another example of the type of leadership and vision that a Jewish leader, that a God-believing leader is supposed to be leading with, not only with physical prowess, but with a sense that God's presence is what is driving everything. Maybe just we'll look at one verse. Let's linger on it for a minute. Look at verse 3 in that quote from Isaiah, who says that there's going to be a sprout from the tribe of Jesse, Yishai. And what kind of a leader is this person going to be? Somebody I think is unmuted should probably just mute again. V'haricho b'yirat Adonai. This is verse 3. This person will smell, have a sense of, just around him, the awe that is required for God. V'lo l'mareh einav yishpot, will not just judge things based on what seems to be right in front of his eyes. V'lo l'mishma oznav yochiach. It's not just what he hears that's going to prove a point. V'shafat b'tzedek dalim. Such an interesting contrast. If you don't just follow your eyes and don't just follow your ears, but you rather are try to attune yourself to some other greater power and force out there, then v'shafat b'tzedek dalim, then you'll be able to judge the impoverished with a sense of justice. V'hochiach b'mishor la'an ve'aretz. Only in that situation will we be able to figure out what the lowly of the land will need. The hika eretz b'shevet piv, will strike down evil lands with his strong words. V'ruach sfatav yamit rasha, will bring down the mighty ones with his lips. V'hayat tzedek ezor motnav, it'll be righteousness around his loins. V'he'emunah ezor chalatzav, and faith around his body. And interestingly, this is the section that leads immediately into the messianic image of a lion lying down with a lamb. So Isaiah has another image of what it means to lead. It's not just leading with force and authority and power. It's leading by being attuned to what God expects of this society, and that's what's going to bring justice. Okay, look at the next source. This is the Malbim. Malbim is a Ukrainian sage, Rabbi Meir Leibush Yechiel Wisser, who lived in the 19th century, and this is his commentary on our verse from Zechariah. Vaya'an vayomer Eli el davar Adonai, Eli zed davar Adonai el Zerubbabel. This is what God said to Zerubbabel. What's going on here, says the Malbim? Hodialo, informed him, shebmenorah hazot, just like in this menorah, this is similar to Rashi, merumaz davar Adonai, there is a hint of the word of God in this menorah of Zechariah, the menorah that we think may be the linkage between this Haftarah and Haftarah, but it's not just the presence of the menorah itself, according to the Malbim. V'havtachato el Zerubbabel, and God's promise to Zerubbabel, shevtiach lo, that he promised him, lemor, saying, lo v'chayal b'lo v'choach, again, we're getting used to these words, it's not with might and not with power, shebe'et yavi et avdo, when God will bring forth his servant, tzemach mizera Zerubbabel, some descendant of Zerubbabel, Az tiyeh hanhagat Adonai bivli emtsa'i. Such an interesting phrase. Hanhagat Adonai bli emtsa'i. The way of God. How did I translate it? The will of God will be manifest in the world almost without an intermediary. Lo al yedei ha'ma'arechet, not by means of any system, which can refer to a military system or even a civic system. She'al zet tzarich chel. For that to happen, for there to be the conquest of a civil or military project, you need some kind of a chayil, some kind of a force to overcome the obstacles in a natural way. That's not the case here. Actually, for this to happen, you need an internal koach. So the koach pnimi here is in contradistinction to a military koach. You need an internal strength. Ki ein hanes shoreh al davar rekan. Miracle does not settle upon something empty. I want to linger on this for a little bit, because this is, to me, a linchpin in what is significant about this Haftarah. All these texts are building towards the idea that leaders and all people get used to the notion that it's from what they have been able to make happen with the authority of their position, or the persuasiveness of their words, or the physical ability of their muscles. That's what accomplishes things. The Malbim here is saying that there's got to be a koach pnimi, it's got to be an internal strength, a strength that is linked to something divine, something spiritual, something that is beyond fiber and bone and muscle. Because if you don't have that internal strength, then the miracles that might be around the corner are not going to be able to come to be, and they're not going to get into your system. I'll tell you where my mind went when I read this. And this is part of the meditation I did on Wednesday. I make this mistake all the time. Because it's so easy to rely on the most powerful weapons you have at your disposal at any given time, it's very hard not to use them. If you know you can raise a voice and get something accomplished, it takes a lot of koach pnimi, internal strength, not to do so. If you know you can turn the screw on someone and it'll result in the project getting done, it's very hard not to do so. If you are in a position of authority with a child, with an employee, with a member of your system, it's very hard to restrain yourself from using that hierarchical structure to get things accomplished. And it has probably been that way since as long as we humans have been evolving. And I believe that a lot of this material that is now being thrown against the Hanukkah story is a rejection of that basic way of being. Rather, the Malbim, I think, is inviting us to consider, you have to prepare your own soul, your own spirit, to have a different kind of strength so that the miracle of things getting done without your muscles, without your flexing your muscles, will be permitted to happen in the world. And I think that is a miraculous process. I think it is a miraculous process when we're able to quiet the urge to just push things to get done and push people in the direction we want them to go, and use softer, more restrained, and more spiritual forces in a system. Look at Radak. Radak is Provence in the Middle Ages. He says something similar on our verse. Vaya'an lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach. He said, not in strength and not in might. Kamoshe ra'ita ma'aseh ha'menorah. Just as you've seen the construction of this menorah, na'aseh ne'elav, was somehow built of its own. Below Adam, without a person, orech hanerot, didn't even set up the candles. Umatzik bahem et hashemen, without a person having ignited the flames. Kain ya'aseh binyan habayit. This is how the building will be built. You can imagine, again, the person hearing this saying, what are you talking about? How is any of this going to get done if I don't force it to get done? The spiritual message is, it will, it can, if you rely on a different sense of where power comes from in the world. Ela beruach ha'el, rather through the Spirit of God, yitbarach u'b'rtzono. May God's name be blessed and may His will be done. To come back to where we began with the choice of this haftarah for Hanukkah. And I think Brandt nailed it, and I want to expand that a little more and end with the words of Professor Eric Myers, who is a professor of Jewish studies at Duke University. I think the rabbis understand, because they knew how things were, and they knew history, that the Assyrian Greeks were not going to be sent away from Judea simply with davening. And I think I'd like to think you know that I'm of the opinion that that just davening fervently for things is not the kind of spiritual strength that I'm talking about here, that it can replace an army when an army is needed and can replace authority when authority is needed. I think there's something more subtle going on. The rabbis do not want the dominant story of Hanukkah to be that just a military army was more powerful than another, but that a people's indomitable spirit was made manifest, and that they found a way to to live out a godly life and a divine life, even if the military might was not present for them in that exact moment. Look at Professor Eric Myers, The Meaning of Hanukkah. This is an article he wrote about 6 years ago. Maybe I'll have someone read this out. Someone who hasn't shared yet today. Who do I see out here? Jeff, do you want to unmute yourself, Jeff Altman, and read what is Hanukkah about?
What is Hanukkah about? Normally, when we think of Hanukkah, we associate it with the miracle of the temple menorah burning for 8 days without sufficient oil, or the victory of the Maccabees over the Seleucid Greeks. As you might well imagine, the celebration of Hanukkah in Israel emphasizes the latter theme and the success of the smaller against the more powerful, more populous outsider. Some of us might also jump to the victory over Hellenism. Adopting foreign ways was seen as something negative in some quarters in antiquity, so bad that defeating it justified the use of force. You might think any and all of these things, but I will question all of these assumptions in this short Devar Torah.
Skip 2 paragraphs, Jeff, and go to where it says not by might, 4:6.
This is the word of Adonai to Zerubbabel. Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, said Adonai of hosts. Our Hanukkah Haftarah ends with this famous line. The rabbis chose to end with a call to Zerubbabel, the heir of the Davidic kingdom, to rule with the Spirit of God and not to attempt force. This eloquent call for reasoned and non-military solution to political realities in a time when Israel was a conquered nation is a message that should not be lost, and it is one that has resonated in many quarters through the centuries.
Pause. You can imagine someone reasonably lampooning this approach, lampooning Zechariah's message as pie-in-the-sky pacifism, blind to the realpolitik that without power things don't get done. And what Professor Myers is saying, the notion that this message was specifically coming into a nation that had already been conquered and saying to them, even though you might think that the way to rise again is to conquer others, I'm still asking you to conquer some of that instinct in yourself, because if you're going to be a nation that's worth anything, and I would add, if you're going to be a person who's worth anything, even if it's possible, even if it's true that some of the things only get accomplished through force and through human power, if you're going to be worthy of that power, there's got to be something else pulsing within you. There's got to be moments where you choose not to act out that power. There must be moments where you recognize what it's like for someone else to be the object of your power, and you hold back. I've been thinking about this all week, my friends, since we're going to read the next 2 paragraphs in a second. Who in my life, I who like to think of myself as a humane person, a gentle person, a thoughtful person, I wield power. I can raise my voice. I have authority. I can snap my fingers and get something done when I need to. Who's experiencing that from me beyond what is necessary to get something accomplished? Who would like me, and I'm asking you to consider this for yourself, who would like me to be Zerubbabel, hearing this message from God and saying, this is not the only way to get something accomplished? It's naive, I think, to believe that wars are won or that battles are won with people just retreating to, a divine spirituality. But I also think that spirits and families and systems are crushed when it's only the military might, or in a different setting, the human power and the power to force that drives things. And Hanukkah, according to the rabbinic story of why this Haftarah was chosen, is inviting us to consider that in our own relationships with the land of Israel and our own relationships with other people. Finish off, Jeff. Why did the rabbis?
Why did the rabbis intend for us to take away from the placement of this Haftarah on Shabbat of Hanukkah? First and foremost, we are encouraged to think about Hanukkah as more than a festival celebrating a miracle of lights and a military victory over the Seleucid Greeks. It is also a festival that celebrates the victory of the human spirit and the universal desire for peace at most any cost.
Beautiful insight on his part, right? That the rabbis took a holiday where peace was won through war and tried to turn it into a holiday of peace for peace's sake. Keep going.
As we know from other sources, neither the Maccabees nor the Herodian successors rejected Hellenism. Rather, we know very well that, like the rabbis after the fall of the temple in the year 70, all embraced the contemporary world of Greco-Roman culture, which allowed Jews to prosper and thrive in a multicultural world. Second, let's also think like the rabbis about Hanukkah, namely that it is a festival that offers a way of peace and reconciliation as articulated by Zechariah the prophet, whose name means God remembers. On this Shabbat, let us remember the lesson of the Persian period. Pragmatic accommodation to a situation not desired can be accepted and made the best of. Even though a majority might have wanted independence from Persia, the practical solution to the situation allowed a relative period of peace to ensue for 2 centuries.
And the temple whose rededication we are celebrating on Hanukkah was made possible by a non-Jewish king, a non-Jewish empire, who already had imbibed on some level the very message that God is giving through Zechariah to Zerubbabel, which is sometimes it is the non-use of your power, the non-execution of your might, and your own connection to your koach pnimi, your internal spirit. That is the most powerful way to live and the most powerful legacy you can bequeath to who knows how many generations. We still think about Cyrus and Darius. There are a lot of ancient kings who lived in the 5th century BCE we know nothing about. We know about them because they allowed our people to come back to our land. They allowed themselves to not conquer everything that was conquerable. And they allowed a people driven more by spirit than by might to continue shining its light in the world. So on this Shabbat Hanukkah, as you think of either the national Jewish story or the very personal story that you're living right now, think very, very carefully about the voice you use, the power you wield, the restraint you ask of yourself, and the way that you allow a spiritual presence to govern what your life will have meant as you walked this earth and as you lived your life as a Jew and celebrated these holidays. So I thank the rabbis for choosing this Haftarah, for forcing us to consider Hanukkah through a more complicated and spiritual lens. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Urim Sameach.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.